All right, welcome back to biology. My name is Mr. Kubuske, and we are here at Cathedral High School in Indianapolis again. So we're still talking about evolution. Last time we talked about like the formation of all the pieces necessary for life on this planet, starting with the Big Bang and working our way through. So now we're actually ready to talk about like how life could have started on this planet. Now, keep in mind, what I'm going to present to you. We teach at a private school here, so I can talk about a couple of different things. I'm not necessarily limited to topics for discussion, but we're going to talk about some different ways that life could have existed or could have begun to exist on this planet. Again, everything I'm going to teach you, I'm going to focus on facts and scientific evidence. I will kind of bring up some different things that may be contrary to people's beliefs. Don't think I'm trying to necessarily change anybody's mind. I'm just presenting the information as we know it, kind of basically. So, anyways, let's get to life on this planet. So, before we talk about how life could have got here, let's talk about how life keeps staying here. For a long time on this planet, believe it or not, it was a widely held belief in something called spontaneous generation. In other words, the idea that life, basically living things come from non-living things. And you may think that that's ridiculous. Why would anybody think that? Well, you got to remember, before the Enlightenment, before people really started to become educated, they really only knew what was around them and what they were exposed to. So when maggots would appear on the rotting meat that was left out, in their homes or in their butcher shops or whatever for long periods of time, it was pretty easy to come to the conclusion that, well, maggots must come from that rotting meat. Like that living thing must come from that non-living thing right there. And again, it may seem crazy to think that, but you might start to think where someone could come up with that. So that idea is called spontaneous generation. Well, again, we get to the point where people start to become educated, start to look at things a different way, start to question things, which didn't necessarily happen before then. And a new idea called biogenesis, which wasn't necessarily a new idea, but an idea called biogenesis started to become more pervasive. In other words, like people started to believe it a little bit more, that this might actually be the way it is, opposed to what we've always been told by this person or that person. So biogenesis is the opposite. It's the idea that living things always come from other living things, which obviously we know at this point to be true. But at the time, you've got a mass of the population that has believed in this one thing, and they support each other and they back each other up, and they just don't want to hear. They turn deaf ear to anybody else's opinion. So some scientists, start to try to work out some evidence, some ways to prove that spontaneous generation could not have been the way that life exists on this planet. And so we're going to talk about three of them. And the first one is a guy named Reddy. And basically what Reddy did is he took 3 jars of meat. He had one uncovered, one had like a gauze over the top of it so air could still get through, but there was still a cover, and then one that was completely sealed. And in the jars he put meat. And basically, he just left them out over time to see which ones would develop maggots. Now, if spontaneous generation were true, then obviously all 3 of them would produce maggots over time. So what actually happened is what you and I would expect to happen. On the open one, obviously maggots and flies appeared. On the sealed one, nothing appeared. It was just the meat. And then on the one with the gauze over the top, the maggots actually appeared on top of the gauze. Well, this wasn't necessarily enough evidence for some people at the time. They may have thought there was more to what was happening, maybe that the air still needed to get through into the meat or something like that, or whatever was occurring to make this happen. Couldn't do it through the gauze or through the seal, so we needed another experiment. So that's where a guy named Spallanzani comes along. Spallanzani does a similar style of experiment, but he does it with meat broth. And basically he boils the meat broth to kill off any microorganisms. And then he sealed one with a cork and then left one open. Well, obviously the one that was open became cloudy because microorganisms began to grow inside it, and the one that was sealed stayed clear. And again, this should have proven that obviously the one got cloudy because the living things that were in there, obviously they reproduced, they were able to get into that, and then life came from that. Because if life just came from non-living things, then there should have been both become cloudy because living things should have appeared in both of them. So again, we still needed more evidence until we've really started to turn people's opinion. So that's where Louis Pasteur comes along. Louis Pasteur, who you've probably heard of from pasteurization, did a lot of studies with microbiology, microorganisms, and so he had this idea to use what's called a curved neck flask. In other words, like the flask would never be closed; it would always be open. But because when he boiled the meat broth, it creates sort of like a plug of water down in this curved neck part. That the microorganisms that we're trying to get in to get to the meat broth to go in there and live and reproduce and eat weren't able to get through because of this curved neck. And so basically he let this curved neck flash sit on his desk for a year, and it never became cloudy. It was always clear, that meat broth that was in it. Okay, and then after a year, he breaks the neck off, and within a day, what do you think happens? Well, obviously, it gets cloudy. So, again, finally, after all this evidence, people start to turn, the tables start to turn, and people start to become aware that obviously life must be coming from other living things. And so that's where we can now reject the idea of spontaneous generation and improve biogenesis. So the reason I tell you this story, one, that's obviously we're talking about life, but number two, it's an example where there's been a widely held belief for a certain period of time without necessarily a ton of evidence. Okay, but yet with some experimentation, with some evidence, we can start to turn the tides on people and turn the tides on the way of thinking and help people become a little bit more enlightened to the topic, which is kind of what we're trying to do a little bit with evolution, people have had to do with evolution over time. So again, we're getting rid of spontaneous generation. Biogenesis is the way that things are. So now let's talk about how life could have actually gotten here, how it could have gotten started. So there's three possible ways that we're going to talk about that life could have began here on the planet. First one is creation by a supernatural being. That's obviously, there's not a ton of way to say that irrefutably that's not possible. We're not going to get into, creationism and all that right now, but it's a possibility. Number two is extraterrestrial origins, the idea that we were seeded. Now, this isn't necessarily to say that intelligent beings purposefully sent, a seed of living material or life material to our planet. It's more the idea that, on these, particles that were flying through space, there could have been remnants of a planet, remnants of living organisms, whatever, on them. And then when that hit that really warm ocean that we talked about in the last section, that possibly that could have, started to springboard things along and start life here on this planet. So again, it's not saying that we were seeded by extraterrestrials necessarily, like in the movie Prometheus or something like that. But it's more the idea that there could have been living pieces or pieces of living things on space debris that landed on this planet, and basically that's kind of how life got its start. And the third one is origins from non-organic material. Now, again, if you might go back a slide and say, well, you just said that wasn't possible. Okay, that's true. But again, life has to start somewhere. And so if we start to think about, the things that were here on this planet at the time that life kind of began, those boiling oceans, the early atmosphere, and the thunderstorms that were going on all around the planet, we can actually recreate that scenario and actually find a way to have life begin on this planet. And that's exactly what two scientists named Miller and Urey did. So Miller and Urey recreated these origins, this early atmosphere, this early primitive Earth, and were able to prove that life-giving materials, in other words, the amino acids needed for life and some of the other organic compounds needed for life, could have been formed from everything that was present on this early Earth, basically. So if we think about what was already there, those gases, and then the really warm water and heat as an energy source, and then obviously this lightning strikes, we can recreate that, and then actually, you can see here, I'll show you the Miller-Urey experiment.
In the 1950s, Stanley Miller, then a graduate student at the University of Chicago, came up with an idea. We could simulate early Earth conditions in the lab, and then carefully watch what happens. If you can't study fish in the sea, set up an aquarium. Working with his professor, Harold Urey, Miller designed an apparatus to simulate the ancient water cycle. Together they put in water to model the ancient ocean. It was gently boiled to mimic evaporation. Along with water vapor, for gases of the atmosphere they chose methane, hydrogen, and ammonia. These are simple gases which scientists at the time thought were probably abundant on the ancient Earth. They added a condenser to cool the atmosphere, allowing water molecules to form drops and fall back into their ocean like rain. The ancient Earth would have had many sources of energy, sunlight, geothermal heat, and even thunderstorms, so they added sparks to the atmosphere to simulate lightning. The goal of the experiment was not to create life, but to simply test the first step in Oparin's model. Can simple chemistry naturally give rise to the complex molecules of life? After running the experiment for just 1 week, their ocean became brownish black. Careful analysis revealed that through a series of reactions, many complex molecules had been produced. Among these were amino acids, special molecules of life that we once thought could only be built inside the bodies of living creatures. This was a pivotal breakthrough in science, so significant in fact that it gave rise to an entirely new field of research now known as prebiotic chemistry.
There you go. So Miller and Urey proved that under these circumstances, under these conditions on the early Earth, that life-giving compounds could have been formed. And so that's pivotal, because that then is kind of where we can get our start. That one kind of has the most scientific backing, and so that's what we're going to focus on here. So the other thing that could have existed at this early time is something called a microsphere. So a microsphere could have been made from these primitive compounds that he mentioned earlier. And if you kind of look at pictures of them, they're basically like protocells. They don't have necessarily the ability to reproduce. They don't have genetic material necessarily that like you and I know. They actually had some remnants of RNA probably in them. They weren't technically living things, again, because they couldn't reproduce. But we can recreate those in a lab. In fact, we can do that in class right now. We have the ability to do that if we recreate, again, those circumstances that we talked about earlier. So we've got life-giving material. We've got these basically building blocks of cells here, right here. So like building blocks of cells, which are building blocks of life. We have everything we need. So now the first cells can finally appear, which is exactly what happened about 3.5 billion years ago when the Archaebacteria first appeared on this planet. And we do have fossilized imprints of Archaebacteria. In fact, they're still found here on the planet today. They're found near deep sea vents, and that's basically where they got their energy from. So deep sea vents are like holes in the crust of the ocean where magma and that super hot rock underneath there basically heats up that water at a super high rate. And so you get this super hot water that these basic little creatures are using as an energy source. They survive off the inorganic carbons that are given off of these deep sea vents. But these are our first life forms. They appeared about 3.5 billion years ago. And if you know the prefix archae means ancient, that might help you to remember this. So these guys don't need oxygen to survive. In fact, they survive on a process called chemosynthesis, which if you think about that word having the synthesis part of the end, probably sounds like photosynthesis. So that's how these guys survive. The same type of process, but instead of carbon, from carbon dioxide and from and energy from the sun, they're using energy from the deep sea vents and the inorganic carbons that's coming out of these deep sea vents in order to produce their energy. So they basically have the place to themselves, for a while. So at this same time, remember that the Earth is just one gigantic ocean. Well, now the first pieces of land are going to start to appear because of the changes that are taking place underneath the ocean and the shifting of those rock layers and those types of things. So these little cratons, these little beginning islands are going to start to appear. So our first continents are going to start to appear at this time about 3 billion years ago. So they basically have the run of the place for a while there until a cousin of theirs comes along called Eubacteria. Now, Eubacteria, U means modern, so these are a modern bacteria. These are the bacteria that you and I interact with on a daily basis. They appeared about 2.8 billion years ago. They're descendants of that Archaebacteria. And cyanobacteria, which is a type of eubacteria that was around at this time, did this brand new cellular process that put out oxygen called photosynthesis. So these cyanobacteria are the first ones to produce photosynthesis, to produce large amounts of oxygen, and they're just going to give it off as a waste product. At the time, like the way we think of CO2 as being a waste product and harmful in our atmosphere now, the same thing was happening here. Like tons and tons of oxygen are being given off to this atmosphere. Well, oxygen in the atmosphere is going to change things big time. In fact, this is our first major cataclysmic event for life on this planet. So about 96% of all the life on the planet was going to be wiped out because of all this oxygen, because they didn't need it at the time. They didn't want it. But the life forms that are going to be left behind are going to start to use this oxygen in a way that has never been used before, and it's actually going to be a bigger benefit to life on this planet. So the Earth is going to continue to change. We've got our first supercontinent forming called Rodinia. It forms about 1.1 billion years ago. So it breaks up about 750, and when it breaks up, it really changes the landscape of our planet. In fact, it changes those ocean currents, that really warm water that we were talking about, and it actually causes what's called the first snowball Earth, or the first ice age on our planet. So imagine the Earth as a giant snowball. Now, when it breaks up, when the ice retreats, again, around 750 million years ago or so, we finally have our first multicellular life forms, and those can only be formed from eukaryotes. And we know from previous discussions that eukaryotes appeared about 1.5 billion years ago, and they appear as a combination of two prokaryotes, so two of those bacteria now living together inside one another. And so now we're ready for evolution. And basically here's where we'll pick up in our next topic when we get to section 3, talking about evolution and the ideas behind evolution. Again, hope you learned something. Thanks for stopping by.